In this lesson, we continue our look at photosynthesis by considering chloroplasts and giving an overview of the two key processes in photosynthesis. First, the chloroplast. Chloroplasts are subcellular organelles in plants and algae where photosynthesis takes place. And just like mitochondria, chloroplasts originated by an endosymbiotic process whereby a free-living prokaryote was engulfed by the ancestor of a eukaryote. Here I have two different schematic looks at a chloroplast. This one is meant to be a little bit more realistic and this one more schematic. Keep in mind, these are not cells that I'm showing here. These are the chloroplasts. They're subcellular organelles. So they're within a cell. You can imagine the cell membrane being way out to the side somewhere. Now, because they originated by an endosymbiotic process, like mitochondria, chloroplasts have both an inner membrane that comes from the original free-living prokaryote and an outer membrane that originated in the cell membrane that wrapped around it as it was engulfed. They also have these membrane-bound sacs inside of them, shown here, or a little bit more realistically shown here, and those are called thylakoids. So this is a thylakoid, and many thylakoids together in a stack are called a granum. The plural of granum is grana. So this is a granum of thylakoids. Now each thylakoid contains space within it. That's called the thylakoid space. So the thylakoid space is the lumen of the thylakoid, lumen being the cavity of a hollow organ or organelle, and then the membrane of the thylakoid is called, unsurprisingly, the thylakoid membrane. And we'll see that the thylakoid membrane is the location of an electron transport chain. So I've only shown one granum here and two grana here, but you can imagine many more of them. I've just left out the others in order to prevent clutter. And the fluid inside the chloroplast is called the stroma. Remember that in cellular respiration we saw that the fluid or the cytoplasm-like stuff inside a mitochondrion was called the matrix. Here the equivalent is the stroma inside the chloroplast. So that's the chloroplast and the structures within it. Now, photosynthesis is made up of two overall processes. The first being the light reactions, which capture light energy and convert it into chemical potential energy, and the second being the Calvin cycle that uses that stored chemical potential energy to build more complex carbon compounds, organic compounds, out of carbon dioxide. The light reactions use light energy to make ATP, our familiar energy currency, and NADPH. We saw NADH in cellular respiration. This is NADPH. It's a different molecule, but similarly is an electron carrier and is going to carry high energy electrons from the light reaction and donate them into the Calvin cycle. The light reactions take place on the thylakoid membrane, and they use an electron transport chain. Remember, in cellular respiration, there was an electron transport chain in the mitochondrion on the mitochondrial inner membrane. Here we have an electron transport chain on the thylakoid membrane. And just like in cellular respiration in the mitochondrion, here in photosynthesis in the chloroplast, the electron transport chain is used to pump protons, and a process of chemiosmosis is used to make ATP. Remember, chemiosmosis involves the creation of a proton gradient. Here, protons are going to be pumped into the thylakoid space. So the thylakoid space becomes a reservoir for protons, just like the intermembrane space did in the mitochondria in cellular respiration. So we're going to use the energy of electrons being passed down an electron transport chain to pump protons into the thylakoid space, and then they're going to be allowed to move back through ATP synthase. Again, this is very similar to what we saw in cellular respiration. In both cases, electrons are passed down an electron transport chain to more and more electronegative carriers that releases energy, and that energy is used to create a proton gradient. The protons are then allowed to move back through an ATP synthase, and the energy that they release in doing that is used to make ATP. So the light reactions capture light energy and store it in ATP as well as in this electron carrier called NADPH. And we'll look at the light reactions and the electron transport chain in more detail in another lesson, but this gives you a bit of an overview for now. The Calvin cycle, also called the dark reactions or the light independent reactions, take place in the stroma. Now, the dark reactions or the light-independent reactions, those are not very good names. We won't use those because the Calvin cycle can take place in the light and in fact needs the ATP and NADPH from the light reaction, so it's not really light-independent either. So we'll give it the better name, we'll use the better name, the Calvin cycle. Again, the Calvin cycle takes place in the stroma, and it uses the chemical potential energy in the ATP and the NADPH that the light reactions have stored. It uses the ATP and the NADPH to synthesize carbohydrates from carbon dioxide. Remember, carbon dioxide itself is relatively low energy compared to glucose. It has less stored chemical potential energy, and so to build up glucose from carbon dioxide takes energy. That energy gets shuttled over from the light reactions, carried by ATP and NADPH. So the two work together. So here we have our schematic diagram of a chloroplast just showing 1 gram of thylakoids to illustrate the interaction between the light reactions and the Calvin cycle. We'll look at these processes in more detail in future lessons, but it's helpful to have a bit of an overview. So the light reactions take place at the thylakoids. Light will enter and hit the thylakoids, and that's going to be absorbed by chlorophyll and other pigments, and power an electron transport chain that then produces ATP and NADPH. Again, we'll look at the details in a future lesson. But ATP and NADPH are going to carry that energy, which was originally in light but now has been captured as chemical potential energy. They're going to carry that energy over to the Calvin cycle. The light reactions take place at the thylakoids, and the Calvin cycle takes place in the stroma. Using the energy from ATP and NADPH, the Calvin cycle is going to convert carbon dioxide that comes in from the air into carbohydrates. And the Calvin cycle, in using the ATP and NADPH, will also create ADP, the spent form of ATP, and NADP+, the oxidized form of NADPH, that will then return to the thylakoids for use in the light reactions. The other thing happening in the light reactions is that water is being split. So water is going to be split, and that releases oxygen. And so the oxygen that we breathe comes from the light reactions. So this gives you just an overview of the interaction between the light reactions and the Calvin cycle, and how they're related to the various inputs and outputs of photosynthesis.